Okay, it's now 7 p.m. If the clerk is ready, I would like to call this meeting of the Urbana City Council to order for Monday, January 24th, 2022.
Ms. Wu,
Here.
Mr. Evans, Ms. Hersey,
Here.
Ms. Colasetti,
Here.
Ms. Bishop,
Here.
Ms. Wilkin,
Here.
Mr. Quisenberry,
Here.
Mayor Marlin.
Here. Next item is approval of minutes from the previous meetings, and that would be January 10th, 2022, and then the council goal setting session, January 6th, 2022. Is there a motion for approval?
So moved. Second.
Moved by Mary Alice, seconded by Sharice. Are there any substantial improvement or corrections? Okay. Will the clerk please call the roll?
I'm sorry, Ms. Wu,
Yes.
Mr. Evans,
Yes.
Ms. Hersey,
Yes.
Ms. Colasetti,
Yes.
Ms. Bishop,
Yes.
Ms. Wilkin,
Yes.
Mr. Quisenberry.
Yes.
That motion passes. Are there any additions to the agenda? Don't believe there are any. Next item on the agenda are presentations and public input. Normally we've done presentations first, but because we have two pretty lengthy presentations, the first will be on the American Rescue Plan, the beginning of that discussion of fund allocation, and then the second is going to be on our financial forecast. We're going to go ahead and do public input first. So if you'd like to address the Urbana City Council, please raise your hand. First up is Aaron Abbott. You have 4 minutes to speak.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can.
My name is Aaron Abbott, and I speak tonight because we find ourselves at a dangerous point. Violent crime is on the rise, and this is not a hypothetical scenario. We are at the point where murders in our community are no longer noteworthy. Is Urbana ready to meet this challenge head on? Is the council ready to meet the challenge? Tonight, my answer is no, we're not ready. The public discourse in Urbana is dominated by trolls. Every week we hear from them. One of them, Christopher Hansen, is currently suing government agencies in a morbid quest to see the video of Officer Chris Oberheim being murdered. He has already submitted 3 FOIA requests for the video. Council members, every week you sit meekly and listen to the ranting lies of trolls who hate the police, sue their opponents, and waste government resources with FOIA fishing expeditions. Councilwoman Sharice Hersey and the ward she represents is most affected by the spike in violence. She introduced the idea of automated license plate readers. That effort was defeated. Why? Because the trolls dominated the public discourse. We unfortunately have rookie council members who take their cues from them. Some even feed them information surreptitiously. Council, this is not a thought exercise. This is not a debate about data ownership. This is about gunshots, bullet wounds, drive-bys, and murder. You hear lies and distortions every Monday night in public input, and you don't correct them. I've heard a couple rookie council members mention that they think that they're not allowed to respond to public input. What are you talking about? Where did that idea come from? Are you worried about some quaint idea of decorum? If so, get over it. Read the Municipal Code, Chapter 2, Article 1, Section 2-5. There's nothing that requires you to meekly listen to slanderous lies. In the midst of all this turmoil, we are now tasked with finding a new police chief. The police are the most direct means of addressing violence. How do you plan to recruit a great replacement for Chief Seraphin? What's going to attract candidates? The chief of police is a very public job. So how does the city of Urbana comport itself publicly in these meetings? But let me offer a suggestion. I suggest you start with the basics. Call people out on their lies. You didn't check your First Amendment rights at the door when you were elected.
That's right.
Step up and speak truth to trolls. To Mayor Marlin, move the public input section to the end of this meeting. This body has important work to do. Hearing the same old recycled garbage from a handful of obsessed trolls does not serve the public good. And lastly, to the public, wake up. Talk to your council person, speak at council meetings, participate, confront the trolls, and challenge their lies. We put it all out there on truthtotrolls.org. Read the articles and decide whether you want a few loud, unhinged people to shape the future of Urbana. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Alan Axelrod.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. My name is Max Axelrod. I am the campaign lead of No Ameren Shutoffs, a $0 all volunteer 53 member organization campaign against utility shutoffs during this pandemic. What many speakers forget to mention is the comparative data between the deaths and long haul COVID and the violence spike that is being decried. So I would urge people to compare those numbers and then to look at this amount of resources that municipalities are being encouraged to put into said responses in an unscientific, punitive manner instead of in a data-driven, systemically literate manner. This is more than talk. This past Thursday, January 20th, the Champaign County Board bipartisanly passed the 12th resolution since the cessation of the utility shutoffs moratorium on utility shutoffs. It was unanimously supported by the Democratic Party county board members, and it was supported by 3 out of the 7 Republicans. It was submitted by a Republican who held firm for 3 months because he realized how this was affecting his community. Now, there are some people who spend money trying to bully people by calling them trolls. That's all I really have to say about that. Now let's talk about the presentation that you have before you tonight. The presentation that you have before you tonight about the RPC highlights a number of areas, one of which is the Dr. Ellis subdivision when talking about the American Rescue Plan funds. Allow me to submit a suggestion for what to emphasize in the Dr. Ellis subdivision when it comes to the American Rescue Plan. Here's a public comment from February 10th, 2020.
We have presentations and public input. I have one public input card from the audience, and this is from Bishop King James Underwood and Reverend Dr. Evelyn Burnett Underwood regarding the Dr. Ellis subdivision sewer problems. They are continually concerned with the Dr. Ellis subdivision sewer problem. Is there anyone else who wishes to address the council?
Every time that you go to an Urbana City Council meeting video, every time between the times that I've been in there, 2017 till the start of the pandemic, almost all of those times, I should say, because people are human and they missed it, you would see some variant of that public comment. There are presentations going all the way back to 2013 about the infrastructural racism concerns in the Dr. Ellis subdivision. Please make sure that that is explicitly accounted for in American Rescue Plan funding. I hope that the RPC data helps to reinforce that. One of the other long-term issues has been access to healthy food in the North Lincoln area. That is also highlighted. You label it, or the presenters label it as the north and east part of the Carl Hospital communities. That is also something that you can do with American Rescue Plan funding. Lastly, if we're going to be talking about sources of crime, it's poverty. By expanding the SWIFT program over at Parkland, we can help to get people better access to good paying jobs and to provide them stipends to help stabilize and their education and living conditions to let them focus So please consider that a gentle reminder. Have a good evening.
Okay, next up is Eddie Pratt Jr.
Good evening. Can you hear me clear?
Yes.
Great. Awesome. First, I'd like to say thank you all for allowing me to speak tonight. I hope that you're all well and safe, and your friends and family are as well. So the big thing, concerning that the ARPA funding, at least for me and probably a lot of other people in the community, is about where the money is going to go. Now, I understand that that may not be on the docket per se tonight, but there's some things that I want to, just put on out there that maybe you should be thinking about. When I think about the Learman area, you're running right into Scottswood and Prairie Greens and all of that. And those are areas that I'm really familiar with because I lived there for a few years when I first got here. Those are also areas that see people, families living under the poverty line. So I would like to see funding allocated in that direction. Also, just as Alan alluded to, the inequitable so-called solution that was posed as far as dealing with the sewer issue in the Ellis subdivision is something that we have the ability now to right a wrong that has been wrong for a very long time. Equity building is what we should be doing with these funds. I mean, that's what it's there for, right? And if you don't know, I am the campaign lead of Match the Mill, the effort to see our workforce training program that is meant to benefit Black and Brown people so that they can raise themselves above the poverty line, do so in earnest, at least to the average amount of enrollment across the state, as the SWIFT program is a participant in a workforce equity initiative. And to that particular point, it is somewhat problematic, at least I saw from all the data and FOIAing and everything that we've done, that for a program to have more training programs than any other participant across the state, to also have the least amount of enrollment. Something is off there. But nonetheless, the fact of the matter remains is that 52 people is not enough to positively impact our community in the way that we need to now. COVID has put a spotlight on inequity in a way that we cannot turn away from. We can't arrest enough people. We can't. We are bottlenecking in this moment. I was out there not too long ago, well, a few hours ago, with all the teachers and all of the students and everyone else, that were out there at that rally. Solidarity, y'all. They're bottlenecking right now. And part of that problem is that people's living conditions, working conditions are precarious in this moment. At this moment, almost no one is fully staffed because they are getting sick. And having, a fair waged job that pays you enough so that you can afford to stay home in lieu of these work policies and now school policies that don't follow best practice to keep people safe. People cannot even afford, literally, to keep themselves safe.
Thank
They
you,
are
Mr. Pratt. Your time is up. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next person to speak is Cale Beckwith.
Hey, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
All right. My name is Cale Beckwith. I work at and the ARB division for the city of Urbana. I was one of the members of ASME 1331 that spoke during the November 8th, 2021 city council meeting to ask for city council members to help finalize our contract. With your support, we were able to finalize a fair contract. So on behalf of all the members of ASME, I would like to thank you for your help as well as your recognition and appreciation during council comments that evening. I'm here tonight to advocate the use of American Rescue Plan Act funding towards premium pay for city employees. I can't speak to the work schedules of all city departments during the course of the pandemic, but I can say that the employees of the ARB division, including forestry, landscape, and the landscape recycling center staff, have worked every day since the initial shutdown in March of 2020 to provide much needed and appreciated city services to the residents of Urbana. In recognition of those dedicated efforts, we ask that the council give serious consideration to designating a portion of the ARPA funds to premium pay for frontline city employees. Thank you for your time tonight and stay healthy. Good night.
Thank you. Next up is Brandy.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thanks. My name is Brandy McCoy, Urbana resident. I'm here to ask the council to consider the use of ARP funds for increasing enrollment of the SWIFT program and for utility assistance and and for utility assistance, as the following presentation will show you are able. Utility debt incurred during the pandemic in Urbana should be cleared by the city. And if the SWIFT program needs to increase enrollment, as they clearly do when you take a look at similar programs around the state, the city can boost that enrollment directly. Cover tuitions, financial aid won't, and provide an additional stipend to ensure people can sustain themselves during their entire program before they land that sustainable job promised in the end. I'll also speak in opposition to moving public comment to the end. Giving the public the opportunity to speak prior to voting is crucial to the democratic process. We're not trolls. We are Urbana citizens moved into actions. We're Urbana citizens performing our civic duty, as several speakers before me have. Civic engagement is a crucial part of these meetings, so don't be mad because you didn't show up. Thank you.
Okay. Next up is Reverend Dr. Evelyn B. Underwood.
Am I unmuted?
Yes, you
Can
are.
you- Thank you.
We can hear you.
Thank you very much. There was a sign that came, well, I don't want to use my time about that. Good evening, Mayor and City Council. I want to thank the previous speakers who talked about some programs that's dear to my heart. The Dr. Ellis subdivision and the program at Parkland, which is at other places. But we've talked about this over the months about the SWIFT program. But let me take tonight, I just want to say that I've been listening and talking to people who are very concerned about not only, and thank the mayor for helping me out with that. I said 250,000, but people can get up to 250,000, but I think it's 2 million local monies for the infrastructure, et cetera. And also that 12.9 million that we're going to talk about tonight that the RPC, Regional Planning Commission. I would like to say, and also let me get to my notes right here. The health concerns, we have health concerns to protect our firefighters, our first responders, all of them. We care about them. Additionally, we care about the life and the health of our area over here, the King and Dr. Ellis area, where we've been fighting for years and years and years. Food insecurity, a center for our young people and adults. Their life depends on it. We know what we're going through. A lot of people know what we're going through, but we need help. We need our city to help us. Our sewer problem. Are we looking to have properties in the King School area and Dr. Ellis subdivision area? It used to be a mobile home over here. Now they got student housing. So we have more people in need of the centers and all that that we need in this area. I don't want to take too much time because I want to get to this part. Also, we want help for people to apply. Who knows how to apply for these things? Who's gonna help them in Jesus' name? I don't want to get too emotional. Let me slow down. And I'm talking about Old Black Joe and Long Tall Sally. Now I understand that I believe we have people helping the people with the language barrier and our immigrants. All those we have the refugee center. But apparently I trust that they are getting the help. But I think again, old Black Joe and Long Tall Sally, I'm talking about the average bear who's Black, who don't understand how to do this. We need somebody to help them to fill out these forms and fill out these papers. Well, it's on the line or it's on this. Some people don't even have that. We got to get them to the library so they can utilize the services there, so they can get to the information. What organization did we gonna give money to help these people? I should say those people, but I might be one of those people because I'm old now. The elderly people. Who's gonna help us? We depend on our city. And I was talking to some people the other day and they said, we're not going back to Africa. We're gonna stay here. Oh, I'm
Dr.
sorry.
Underwood, your time's up, but we can
Okay.
get help for you to fill out the forms for the equal funding.
Thank you. Will you put that in writing and let it be on radio and TV, like the Victor over Vinus, they putting help, if there's going to be some help. Yes, ma'am.
We could figure out how to help people who need it. Okay, next up is Julie Watkins.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, you're working on the ARPA funds, and I agree with what people have been saying about what people need, and the support. I agree with support for people to get the jobs programs like SWIFT and good healthy food and the infrastructure, and I'm just supporting and in solidarity with people that really need it, because I feel safe. I want everybody to feel safe and have the services they need, and that's the input that I wanted to do when you're talking about this funding. Thank you very much for hearing me.
Thank you. Does anyone else wish to address the Urbana City Council? Linda? Please state your name for the record.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Linda,
Can
and
you state your last name, please?
yes, my name is Linda Kwan, and good evening. I'd like to thank the City Council and the Urbana Police for understanding that there's a real need for a more sensitive approach to the needs of the community, particularly.
Could you, excuse me, Linda, could you start the timer, please? Thank you. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. Sorry, one moment. Okay. So I'd like to thank the City Council and Urbana Police for understanding that there is a real need for a more sensitive approach to the needs of the community, particularly in relation to mental health, especially as the stress of the past 2 pandemic years have really taken their toll on so many. I understand that you have created a crisis co-response team to consist of a partnership between police officers and social workers to be able to more sensitively respond to calls with a mental health component. And I also understand that Lieutenant James Corey Coker is heading up this initiative. And from his resume, he sounds like he could be a good choice for the job. He served as the crisis intervention team coordinator and has been an instructor in conflict management. However, I'm also aware that Lieutenant Coker was also the senior officer present at the violent apprehension of Ms. Aaliyah Lewis, and though he may not have physically assaulted Ms. Lewis, he did say some very troubling things during the event. At the time when 3 officers were holding her down on the ground, Officer Coker being one of them, Ms. Lewis said that she had a question. And in response to this, Officer Coker said, "Now you don't approach us, we got guns and stuff." Soon after this, he also said to Ms. Lewis, quote, "You need to act like a lady. You're not right now." Now, the City of Urbana, you all commissioned an independent investigation into this April 10th incident with Aaliyah Lewis and the Urbana Police Department's use of force. And in that report that was produced for the investigation in section 4 on page 26, there's a section entitled Verbal Engagement. And in this section, the report states that, quote, "We note, however, at certain times in the encounter with Lewis, officers used language with Lewis that may be viewed as patronizing or unprofessional." The report specifically quotes Officer Coker's statement about "you need to act like a lady." Now, the report also goes on to say that officers should always be professional and cognizant of their word choice in meeting, even when interacting with civilians who are uncooperative or assailants. And they talk about highly agitated subjects may be further angered when they perceive that they're being put down or patronized by language used by those in position of authority. And that if not already in place, training should be provided on how best to engage agitated subjects. Now, my concern is that this initiative you put into motion, while it is a great initiative, I applaud that, this is meant to be addressing mental health needs within the community when responding to police calls. But my concern is that it's being headed up by the very person who felt it was appropriate to shut down Ms. Lewis's agency to ask a question when she's being assaulted and restrained by saying, "You don't approach us, we got guns." And also the same person who is cited in the report that the City Council commissioned, saying that his language was unprofessional and patronizing. Now, on that day, I was a direct witness to all of this, and Ms. Lewis had asked repeatedly for a female officer to come search her before any of the other officers had approached her. Now, none of the things that happened to her that day needed to happen. It could have been a very simple thing without event, without a violence. If there was a female officer present, or if there wasn't, which there wasn't, one could have been called. The other thing is that nobody spoke to her. Nobody communicated anything to her. When the officers came running over to her, first 1, then 2, then 3, it was not with any kind of calm communication, speaking to her, telling her why they were detaining her companion or what was going on, that they needed to search her. They didn't say anything about if she's under arrest, what her rights were. None of these things were communicated. Instead, the officer, a man, she had already asked for a female, mind you, he grabbed her.
Your time is up. Thank you very much. You could finish your comments in an email if you'd like.
All righty, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, does anyone else wish to address the Urbana City Council? All right, I don't see any hands up. We'll move on to the first of the two presentations tonight, and I want to make sure Ashley McLaughlin and JD McClanahan have been elevated to panelists. Is Ashley here tonight?
Yes, I'm here, and I do believe we
there you
are both
Okay,
panelists.
Great. I didn't see your name. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Okay.
JD, and I'm here too.
Good. Carol Mitten, I believe, wanted to introduce this. I have a few comments or word background information, and then we'll pass this over to the representatives from the Regional Planning Commission. And again, this is the next in a series of updates from the RPC on the American Rescue Plan recovery funds and the allocation process.
Actually, the introduction is going to be made by Will Kolchowski, if he could be promoted to a panelist. Will has been our staff lead on this with RPC, so I'd like him to give the introduction, if he could be let in.
Go ahead, Will.
Sorry, it kicks you out there when you get added as a panelist. So yeah, thanks for your time, everybody. So before we kind of get into all the substance of today's presentation, I thought I'd just take a moment and kind of go over again kind of the process of how we got here. So this all kind of, once we found out that we're getting this money from the American Rescue Plan Act, we kind of came to council and indicated that we would need to hire some outside staff. This was for a couple of reasons. It was kind of one being the public engagement process, and that would then inform all the priorities for this the spending of these funds. Helping with some soliciting proposals and then reviewing all those proposals, and then also to ensure that the money and the programmatic outcomes were properly documented and in compliance with federal standards. So luckily, we have the RPC just in our backyard here, and they're great at all those things. So we entered into a contract with them, a project and fiscal management agreement, and we presented that contract at the August 16th committee of the whole meeting, and that was voted unanimously out of it into the city council meeting, where it was then approved. In October, on the 11th, we came to city council with a timeline for that process based off the contract, and it kind of showed that there were kind of three main phases, and that was the background work and synthesis of priorities, and that's the phase that we're in now. And that results in the concept plan, which is the second phase, and then you have the implementation of all the projects that are awarded funds based off that concept plan. So you kind of see in the presentation that we're still on schedule from what we presented in October, and then kind of we're here today to go over kind of an overview of the input and priorities to date. So with that, I'll just kind of turn it over to the mayor, who has some things she'd like to say about the final rules, as well as some best practices about uses of these funds.
Thanks, Will. Could we have the slides, please? Great, thank you. I just wanted to give some background information just to remind the council and also the public how we got to this place. If you remember, the American Rescue Plan Act was signed into law on March 11th, 2021. So about a year after the pandemic swept over the country, we had a $1.9 trillion federal investment in recovery. Of course, everyone thought the recovery would be farther along than we are now, but we are where we are. And this was a very broad, wide-ranging infusion of funds, but one of the most significant parts of this from our perspective is that it represented the first time that recovery funds were paid or accessible by and directly by city and county governments. So of that $1.9 trillion infusion of funds, the state and local fiscal recovery funds, you sometimes see that as shortened as the SLFRF, represented about $130 billion was available to city and county governments, about $65 billion to municipalities, and about $65 billion to county governments. Another important thing to remember is, and this was actually the result of some very intense lobbying by organizations like the U.S. Conference of Mayors, National League of Cities, and mayors from all over the country. We spent a lot of time telling our elected officials in the federal government how important it was that cities and counties have access to funds to directly counter some of the impacts of the pandemic. There is lost revenue, there's increased costs, there's financial and impacts on cities as well as our communities. And the portion that's now been designated for city recovery is partly due to the really tremendous effort that we all made to try to get these funds available to our communities. These are non-recurring one-time funds, but when you hear ARPA funds, at least when it comes to the city government, these are one-time funds. Urbana is slated to receive about $12.97 million. We have received the first half of that. That money is in our fund, is in the bank, and we can request the second half later this year, I believe, starting in May. Another significant milestone was the final rules were released by the U.S. Treasury Department just a couple of weeks ago on January 6th, 2022. Back in May of 2021, we had interim rules, and a lot of people began planning for the allocation of their funds based on those rules. The final rules represent some significant, or included some significant changes, really changes. They made, broadened some categories, made additional uses eligible. They also made it much simpler for cities to get revenue replacement, and they gave much more flexibilities for cities to spend the money. So it's actually very fortuitous that we are at this point in time, we now have the final rules and we know exactly the rules we're operating under. The funds have to be obligated by December 31st, 2024, so roughly 3 years from now, and the funds have to be spent by December 31st, 2026, so basically 5 years from now. And as Will said, the Champaign County Regional Planning Commission will assist us with the project and fiscal management services. And throughout this, the main purpose and one of the overall purposes of the American Rescue Plan funds is to provide a shorter term stimulus, but with long-term positive impacts. And again, toward recovery and moving on after the pandemic. Throughout the past year, I've been on a lot of conference calls, and we've read a great many documents and have turned to some sources for advice and recommendations. And one of the things we've seen throughout the past few months is recommendations for best practices for allocating and expenditure of these funds. So I wanted to give you a summary of, and there's remarkable similarities coming from a number of different sources. So based on recommendations from the U.S. Treasury Department, the Government Finance Officers Association, U.S. Conference of Mayors, the Illinois Municipal League, and the National League of Cities, among others, here's a summary of what they recommend as best practices for utilizing these funds. The first thing to recognize is that these are non-recurring recovery funds, and they're very well suited for municipal revenue replacement, which was one of the original purposes for these funds, general government services, or investment in public infrastructure and long-term assets. And again, it reflects the fact that these are non-recurring funds. All these organizations recommended that as we go about considering allocation, that we should identify service gaps in the community and recovery gaps in the community. A lot of different entities, organizations are receiving ARPA funds in one form or another, and we're best utilizing these funds when we collaborate and try to work cooperatively with other organizations. Another very important aspect of this is that we should prioritize the historically underserved, marginalized, or disproportionately impacted groups in the community and sectors of the economy. The pandemic affected people and various parts of the economy disproportionately, and these funds are also designed to help compensate for that. Everyone stressed the importance of the allocation should reflect community input and engagement, and that's one of the beauties of having funds sent directly to municipalities and counties, is that it can be tailored to our individual communities rather than one size fits all. They stressed that any programs, services, and interventions that are supported by the recovery funds should be evidence-based or structured in such a way that they can build evidence throughout the use of the funds and through program evaluation. So that gave flexibility for funding both established organizations and perhaps trying new ideas, if you can have the ability to build evidence as you go and evaluate as you go. They also stressed that programs, services, interventions supported by the recovery funds that are going to require a financial commitment after the initial investment, because these are one-time non-recurring funds, they should include a proposed sustainability plan and a plan for funding in the future, if that's going to be a requirement. And again, we should strive to leverage these funds by collaborating with other local taxing bodies, community partners, to really broaden and enhance the impact across the community. This represents really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make a transformative difference in our community, and we're all committed to using these funds wisely. Next slide. So general broad, and these are very broad next steps, but tonight you'll have a comprehensive update from the RPC. We'll be soliciting, deciding with the council how to solicit or what kind of input you want on identifying priorities. I will be bringing to the council the City of Urbana recovery needs, which would include opportunities, for example, for premium pay for employees or revenue replacement and that sort of thing. Then we'll also finalize the priority areas for funding and the desired outcomes that you wish to impact. That'll lead to the development of the concept plan and the implementation. So that's what's going to be happening over the coming months. But today I'm really happy to bring this program over to staff from the Regional Planning Commission, and they'll be providing a great deal more detail. And I will say that the overview of the final Treasury rules for use of these funds was included in the City Council packet, along with the additional information on socioeconomic information about our city. So Ashley and JD, go ahead.
Great, thank you. I'm Ashley McLaughlin. I'm a planning manager at the Regional Planning Commission, and I'm presenting with JD McClanahan tonight. He's also a planner at RPC. We are excited to be starting this conversation. We have spent the last several months looking over thousands of pages of city plans, budgets, and public input to bring you a sort of a foundation of local priorities tonight. So this foundation will help serve to hopefully provide some framework for these one-time funds. The first slide that we have here is just an overview of our timeline. So as Mayor Marlin and Mr. Kolchowski already referenced, we are carrying out this approach that has three main phases. We have this first column that we're in right now, the background research and synthesis of priorities. Next, we will be developing a concept plan that will serve as a comprehensive guide to the city's overall ARPA strategy. And then lastly, implementing the concept plan. So that will include all the education, outreach, applicant recruitment, and all the reporting necessary to carry out or to distribute the funds. So in the, well, back to the first phase that we're currently in. where we are right now is this very first bullet. So compiling information on the regulations, existing city priorities, and looking at any gaps we might have in the existing priorities. So just to give you an overview of tonight, we have identified 6 broad priority areas as a result of going over existing plans and current public input. Really just trying to start getting at that question of what is important to the city and how can this one-time influx really help us invest in our collective values as city officials and city residents. This will also actually help us pave the way for reaching out to the public and starting to get some input on, you know, what we see in what is documented as the existing priorities and what people see as the existing priorities, what has changed, you know, what has the impact been on them during the pandemic and what they see as most important. This existing research will also help us in later stages as we start to need to develop more specific goals and metrics for the concept plan and to measure kind of the impact of the implementation. So tonight we're going to give you kind of an overview of our findings. And then by the end of the meeting, we hope to walk away with enough feedback to be able to begin rolling out some public input measures. So the next slide shows some key dates that the mayor already reviewed, so I won't talk about those. The slide after that includes just some very basic funding totals. The mayor mentioned the 12.97 million that the city will be receiving. The top line shows the amount approved for administration. That represents about 3% of the funds. And then there are 2 kind of other very general categories that the funds can be used for. The priority is for internal city staffing and government expenses. And then the remainder will be available for any other non-government or outside priorities or projects that meet the priorities as defined by the council. So the next slide will give just an overview of our presentation tonight. So we're going to briefly go over the federal guidelines, which have already been touched on a little bit. The meat of our presentation is really going to be talking about what we've identified as these 6 overarching priorities. And JD will present that. And then lastly, we'll talk about some next steps. So like the mayor mentioned, you did receive the overview of the final rule in your packet. So I'm just going to touch on a few of the highlights there, and then we'll move on to talk about the priorities. So the next slide. So very basically for eligible uses, local revenue replacement is the kind of the main emphasis of this funding. The most significant change in the final rule allowed up to $10 million of our allocated funds to be automatically eligible for government expenses. Previously, governments had to prove loss of revenue before spending ARPA funds on government services. So this signifies a pretty big shift that after hearing from communities and members of the public, the federal government made this a lot more flexible and really wanted to emphasize that cities can and should use this money how they feel like they need to in order to recover the government services they may have lost or fallen behind on during the pandemic or even before. Next, COVID-19 public health and economic impacts. This feels pretty straightforward, but it's actually a very broad category, and there's very broad discretion when spent on groups deemed to be disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And the final rule even expanded further how impact is defined. Third, there's premium pay for essential workers, which was already referenced. That also has been, the eligibility for that has been expanded slightly with the final rule, although the impact or focus remains on lower income and frontline workers for premium pay. And then lastly, investments in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. This is pretty straightforward. These are typical government services, and that category remains pretty much the same, but actually did also get some eligibility broadened in the final rule as well. So the next slide touches on the ineligible uses, which I'll go ahead and say out loud for the record, just for clarity. This money is not eligible for paying off pension obligations, debt service, or legal obligations from settlements or judgments. It is not eligible for depositing into rainy day funds, reserves, etc., or offsetting tax cuts. Also not eligible for uses that violate or work against ARPA or any other federal, state, or local laws, which seems pretty obvious, but needs to be put in writing. So next, I'm actually going to go ahead and turn it over to JD, who's going to talk about the overview of those 6 broad priority areas I've mentioned that are based on Urbana's existing plans and public input.
Great, thanks, Ashley. So like Ashley mentioned, my name is JD McClanahan, and I'm a planner with RPC, and I'll be presenting the next section about ARPA priorities. With the background in place that Ashley just presented, the section will discuss our local priorities for ARPA funding. First, we'll review the best practices that Mayor Marlin compiled and presented earlier. Next, we'll mention the existing plans and public input that were consulted to develop a list of city priorities. And then finally, we'll discuss the list of identified priorities, how they're already kind of being addressed locally, and how the ARPA funds could be used for those priorities. I do want to say off the top that this section is going to be pretty heavy on content, but our goal is to present to you all the work that we've compiled. And then after I finish, Ashley will lead the discussion on how we actually use this information. And at that point, we can address any questions or concerns that you have from the presentation. These slides have also been provided to city staff for y'all to consult after the presentation. So don't worry if you don't have a chance to kind of fully analyze some of the slides that are more text heavy. That content will be available for you after the fact if you want to dive in more deeply. So because Mayor Marlin already presented this compiled list of best practices, I'm not going to dwell too long on it, but I did kind of want to reemphasize some of the decision-making points that she raised. As previously discussed, these are non-recurring funds, so it's helpful to think about how they can be used as a productive one-time investment. In considering where to spend this investment, it's also helpful to consider existing gaps in services, traditionally underserved groups, community sentiment, and existing work and priorities that have been laid out by the city of Urbana. In addition, the investments should be analyzed based on their ability to address the problem at hand. If the selected programming that you want to fund would need later money to be spent, it's important to consider where those later funds would come from. It's also useful to think of how collaborations with other governments or partners can allow this money to be leveraged more effectively. In developing the list of city priorities that we worked on, RPC staff consulted a range of officially adopted documents from several decades, the past few decades of Urbana history, looking both at long-term goals and priorities as well as more immediate needs reflected in kind of more recent council goals and city budget. Recovery is a key word in this program. Like Mayor Marlin mentioned, it's called the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Funds. Primary point is helping local governments recover from the pandemic. Because of this, there may be needs that have come up recently that may not be found in some of these older documents, and that's perfectly valid. But these kind of established priorities can help establish context to guide some of the future actions for these funds. In addition, RPC staff also analyzed public input from the ongoing Imagine Urbana comprehensive plan update in order to gauge more recent priorities and sentiments from the community. From the Imagine Urbana survey, the responses to these 4 questions were provided, as these questions kind of were the most relevant for thinking about kind of future goals and investing the ARPA funds. The bar graph at the right of this slide shows the quantity of comments sorted by the 6 themes that we're going to dive deeper into in a bit. Within these themes, there were kind of some broad categories that also were reoccurring. So things like downtown redevelopment, government transparency and finances, and things like violence prevention. But diving back into the main 6 themes, you can see the list of these themes below. The 6 priority areas that we kind of noticed and called out are sustainable infrastructure, public health and safety, economic recovery and development, adequate and affordable housing, human rights and social services, and public spaces and resources. As you can see here, the first 4 priorities were also the main themes that the council recently worked on compiling with the mayor as your main priorities for the coming session. while these final two themes are ideas that staff noticed recurring in the plans and public feedback and thought were also worth including on this list. The list was also originally longer than this, but a few of the previous priorities that we had on here, the ones with kind of the lowest response levels from the Imagine Urbana and the plans were merged for kind of simplicity's sake and streamlining, as well as to make these top 4 priority areas line up more accurately with the way that the council and mayor have defined them for your priorities. So now that we have an idea of what those 6 main priority areas are, we're going to dive more deeply into each priority. This slide provides the structure that we will use to discuss these priority areas. First, providing a definition of that priority area, then looking at how it comes up in existing plans and Imagine Urbana feedback. Next, we'll look at what work is already being done locally in regards to this priority area. And finally, we'll mention a few examples of how other municipalities are using their ARPA funds in this particular area. So the first priority is sustainable infrastructure. Sustainable infrastructure encompasses investments in physical infrastructure like water, transportation, electricity, and internet to ensure that local infrastructure systems are adequate and resilient for current needs and future changes, including population growth, climate change, and technological innovation. Sustainable infrastructure makes an appearance in existing city documents in a variety of ways, including ensuring that transportation infrastructure provides a variety of mode choices like pedestrians and bikes, ensuring that focusing on kind of large scale goals to reduce emissions in the city, and ensuring that the city is prepared for the effects of climate change on things like future weather hazards and future water use needs. Comments from the Imagine Urbana survey reflected similar things as the ones that we saw on the previous slide. Things like preparing for climate change, reducing environmental impact, and ensuring that infrastructure is safe and accessible to all residents. Looking at sustainable infrastructure initiatives outside of ARPA, so things that are already happening locally, the city has taken a variety of approaches, including the recently created Equity and Quality of Life Fund, investing in alternative transportation, and encouraging things like solar power and rain barrels. At the state and federal level, we can see Illinois' recently passed energy law from last year, as well as the funding likely to come to the area from the bipartisan infrastructure law, and if it does pass in the future, from Build Back Better at the federal level. Looking at how other municipalities have used their ARPA funds, council members may have seen the news that Champaign plans to use around half of their funds toward infrastructure improvements in the Garden Hills neighborhood, particularly lighting and drainage infrastructure improvements. Similarly, cities across the country are investing in things like water, sewer, and broadband updates, energy efficiency incentives, as well as investing in programs like regional food systems or creating local conservation corps. So with that, moving on to the next priority area. Public health and safety encompasses a range of issues affecting the well-being of community members, including violence prevention, pandemic response, encouraging physical activity, and creating safe public spaces, and addressing the day-to-day health stressors like exposure to harmful substances in the home. Local plans reflect a variety of goals within this area, including mitigating violence, ensuring a fair criminal justice system, providing healthy home environments, and ensuring that residents can safely enjoy the outdoors and travel throughout the city. Public comments run along those same themes, preventing violence, ensuring that residents can walk, bike, and be outdoors safely, ensuring fair treatment of all residents, and addressing the whole scope of health needs, including mental health. Urbana and other local governments have taken a broad range of approaches to address local health and safety, including supporting local emergency responders, investing in de-escalation and crisis intervention, providing mental health support, and collaborating to address the need for testing and treatment in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. And these are just a few of the types of programming that cities are using their ARPA funds on, including investing in local testing and vaccination against COVID, investing in behavioral health interventions, violence intervention, street safety, and other health and safety programs, as you can see here. The next priority area is economic recovery and development, which encompasses support to both businesses and individual workers, from firm recruitment to business expansion and retention to workforce training, as well as providing the community infrastructure for workers and businesses to succeed. Planning objectives from past plans for economic development include support for existing businesses, individual workers, as well as recruitment of new businesses. In addition, several previous plans involve place-based investments to make Urbana's commercial areas more appealing and accessible, and to further develop local tax revenue. The wide variety of these concerns are also affected in community comments, where residents desired a more robust commercial tax base in the city, wanted support for local and small scale businesses, and wanted support for development, particularly for the commercial areas of downtown Urbana and the Philo Road corridor. The huge list of programs here shows kind of the wide variety of programs that have worked to address economic concerns during the pandemic, particularly in the early days as governments worked to support businesses and workers, as everyone was really at the beginning stages of adjusting to the pandemic. In addition to these kind of short-term or recent pandemic relief programs, local economic development has included TIFs and enterprise zones, downtown redevelopment projects, as well as ongoing programming from RPC, Champaign County EDC, and the Small Business Development Center. ARPA economic development support in other cities has included funding for small businesses and neighborhood commercial districts, targeted support for specific business types like female or minority-owned businesses, as well as subsidizing workforce training and support in a variety of fields, including currently needed sectors like healthcare and childcare. The next priority area is adequate and affordable housing, which means that Urbana invests in ensuring that all community members live in safe and healthy housing that they can afford, whether that means helping the houseless get back on their feet, updating older housing stock, constructing new units to meet demand, or providing financial supports to keep people in their homes. Documented goals in housing include supporting the quality of the housing stock, the security of residents in keeping their housing, and ensuring equal access to housing. In addition, the city has stated a desire to revitalize neighborhoods with aging or lacking housing, and to prepare the housing stock of the city for future climate resiliency. Resident responses about housing have reflected the need to refurbish or redevelop older housing stock, create more mixed income and integrated neighborhoods, including through the strategy of small scale multifamily development, and to provide more supports through subsidized housing and shelter facilities for houseless residents. Similar to with the economic development initiative slide, a variety of pandemic programs have emerged to address the immediate housing concerns that arose from the pandemic, including additional HUD home funds, additional vouchers to the Housing Authority, and new rental support programs. These are built on existing local supports, things like the existing Housing Authority of Champaign County programming, home refurbishing and weatherization programs that are offered through RPC, assistance through Cunningham Township, and local service providers like CU at Home. Cities have used ARPA funds for a variety of housing programming, including cash assistance to help residents make rent, mortgage, utility payments, property tax assistance, basically any kind of cash assistance to keep residents in their homes, as well as investments in constructing or acquiring facilities for public housing, emergency shelter and transitional housing, as well as working with local housing stakeholders to help place voucher holders in rental housing. The next priority area is human rights and social services, which encompasses programs that ensure that Urbana welcomes and supports all community members, regardless of income, background, or personal attributes, and that Urbana provides opportunities for all residents to thrive. Documents reflecting this priority include the resolution last year to end structural racism and achieve racial equity, as well as a variety of initiatives to ensure that all Urbana residents have access to their needs and services, ensuring that all Urbana neighborhoods are safe, resilient, and enjoyable for their residents. Community members echoed this desire, requesting more engagement with and resources to historically excluded communities, as well as providing whatever needed services residents need to thrive in the community. Locally, the city's Office of Human Rights and Equity is working to realize these goals and is collaborating with a variety of partners, including Cunningham Township, the local Head Start program, and nonprofits like First Followers and local immigrant services organizations to ensure that all residents are being served by city programming. ARPA initiatives in other cities that have addressed these needs include helping communities with particular barriers access government services. So you can see in that first bullet point, members that might have issues with access, like undocumented community members or senior populations, helping them access services, enhancing existing service providers in light of increased needs from the pandemic, and partnering with institutions like local school districts to meet residents where they are and address their needs in a streamlined way. Lastly, the final priority area is public spaces and resources, which includes spaces and programs available for all, including parks, schools, community programming, and involvement in communication with local government. Existing documents state the goal of providing healthy and enjoyable public realm for local residents, including through parks, bike and pedestrian facilities, public waterways, and built up public spaces like the downtown area. Resident responses in this priority area showed a desire for public events and programming to engage local citizens, making downtown a vibrant core of the city, and making a concerted effort to engage with all community members and to ensure that public spaces reflect the needs of all of the individual communities and residents within Urbana. The city provides a variety of current programs in this area, including arts and culture investments, the market at the square, and updating public facilities, as well as green and recreation spaces provided by the urban forestry program and the Urbana Park District. ARPA programs in this category include developing youth programming to keep children active and engaged, park investments in underserved neighborhoods, funding for the visual and performing arts, and increased hours and services at recreation facilities in light of the increased need from the pandemic. So now that I've covered all of that information, Our final section will be Ashley discussing how to actually apply this information and use it through the next public input and planning steps. In her section, you'll get a chance to talk through whether these priority categories make sense to you and how you want to use them for future steps. So I will go ahead and hand it back over to Ashley.
Okay, thank you. So I know that was a lot to digest, and all of those priority areas are, of course, important and relevant for funding. And they're all very broad. So they capture a lot, but they don't necessarily capture everything. Additionally, $12 million or $12.9 million isn't going to be adequate to address all of those priority areas. So the assumption is that in order to make a significant and lasting input with this money, that it would be helpful to narrow down the priorities to one or two that people think are most relevant or important for this funding or for this time. We also think it'd be useful to have priority areas as a way to solicit additional public input. So of course, all of those priorities that JD just mentioned are already based on a lot of public input. But given that this is a new source of funding with its own set of goals and requirements, it makes sense to get additional input on the potential applications of the funding. And also just to get a sense of where people are at right now in the pandemic and how they feel about the application of these recovery funds. So at this stage, in order to get public input, the most kind of common and efficient way to do it would be to develop a survey. So the next slide shows we have put together a template for a public survey to administer at this stage. The first question being, which priority areas do you think should be the focus of COVID recovery funds for the city? Pick one or two. But really at this point, we would like to step back and just hear from council about, after attempting to digest those 6 priority areas, are there any questions about the priority areas or about how they're defined and about this approach of taking these priority areas or more or less to the public to begin to solicit input? Are we missing anything? Are there any questions up to this point? Feel free to speak. I don't know, should I call on people?
That's how we usually do things.
Okay.
If I can go ahead.
Yes, please. Sorry.
I'm comfortable with the first 5. I'm not sure about the 6th one fitting into the focus that I believe I've heard from various individuals and even from our discussions on council. It's not that I don't believe public spaces and those kinds of resources are important. I just don't know that I would include that with the first 5.
Okay. Anyone else? Any comments or questions on those priority areas? Yes.
I'm going to guess you're guessing.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm staring at you. I didn't know that.
Yeah. So I would say, I think one thing that stands out to me related to James's point, I think, with looking back over those plans from years on end, right? And I appreciate all the hard work that went into that. It might not be as responsive to the needs of this particular moment, right? So with the specific pandemic related needs, it's not that focusing on public spaces and resources aren't important, but I think some aspects of those that are going to be more salient might be captured in some of these other categories that kind of gets diluted when you're looking back over, plans that were specifically about those things, right? So there's some of the plans that you looked at were specifically focused on that area. So that's going to have a kind of a potential to distort the impact as well. I think my one question in terms of the other goals, especially, is if we're soliciting feedback on these goals, how are they being defined, right? These are very broad categories. And if you're asking people, pick one or two, what I interpret them to mean might be very different than what someone else interprets those to mean.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And we run into this in other plans as well. So typically what we would do is just provide a short definition that we would get, run past city officials or maybe back to the council to make sure that makes sense, but we would include a short definition. And it's true, they are very broad and they are up to interpretation. So one thing that we would also recommend in a survey like this would be to do a follow-up question as well. That would be something a little bit more specific. So for instance, it might be on the next slide or it might not, the one after that. So what specific goals do you have for this priority area, for instance? So then we have a little bit more information about how they're thinking about it and what are the actual results that they would hope to see. So maybe to them it fit into one category, maybe to us it fits in another. Maybe that really doesn't matter too much in the end, but getting a better sense of not just what they think is important, but what are the outcomes that we're actually hoping to achieve with this funding, so we can create more specific goals and objectives related to that. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Sure. Mary Alice.
So one of the things that I'm struck by is how to gather input. And I think we've heard from a variety of people that using just online resources kind of puts people who don't have access, who maybe don't understand how to use online resources at a disadvantage. So I've been trying to brainstorm really quickly here in terms of like what other ways can we meet people? One way is I really like I think Will is the one who mentioned, meet people for where they're at, right? So one possibility would be distributing paper surveys to maybe the schools, maybe some of the other kind of organizations, definitely the library. I know that data entry is an issue there, but I think that we would reach more people, and especially if we're trying to reach marginalized communities, disadvantaged people, we need some other outlets of gathering the information. The other thing I'd like to recommend is holding 1 or 2 town halls for us to not only, provide paper forms that people can fill out, but also to have people just give us more input. And certainly you can follow up more if you're actually able to engage with people. So those are just my initial reactions to how to gather the information. I would agree both with Councilmember Colsetti and Quisenberry that public spaces, I think that some of that can be under well-being if it is directly part of, the COVID impact. So I think that can be rolled up a little bit. So anyway, those are my initial thoughts. I really appreciate all the work that you put into this. I really like the organization of it. And so I look forward to the next steps.
Great, thank you. Well, if we could actually move to the next slide really briefly, and then we'll get back to additional questions. And I don't have to go through this now, we can save this for later, but the point about online not being enough is well taken. I think at the very least, we would make paper copies available at some common locations. I like the idea of distributing them to specific organizations or schools as well. I think that makes sense. So yeah, we do have some additional ideas for outreach and how to make this as accessible as possible, but I will go ahead and get back to some additional questions and we can get into more of those details later, perhaps. Councilperson Wilkin, I think you were next.
Thanks. Thank you guys for the presentation. I appreciate looking at those different avenues and putting it together in a really organized fashion. A lot of my stuff's already been covered about the survey stuff. I'm glad that there'll be some definitions and a chance for some more open-ended input. And Mary Alice already brought up about what you showed the other methods and possibly a town hall or public hearing I hope we can do as well. And I think overall, these 6 areas that you've identified overall, I think look good to me. And like you said, they're broad enough that they're still flexible and can encompass a lot of different things. And it is hard to not think about being able to do all of them. So I understand that we do have to narrow it down and prioritize. And that's, I think, going to be really hard. I just right off the bat, since you're asking initial feelings, I do feel like 1 or 2 is almost too narrow. And like when I was looking at them, I feel like I want to see them all. And I'm trying to think specifically also about COVID recovery in this instance. And I feel like the ones that make the sense in that one are the public health and safety, economic recovery, and the human rights and social services, since there's been so many exacerbated disparities. So I think they're all great, and it's going to be really hard to narrow it down. I don't know if we have to be limited to 2 or 3 right off the bat. But I think, even a few, but I feel like 3 or 4 might be reasonable. And we've got still quite a few millions of dollars. And I guess it all depends on what we're trying to do, but that's some of my initial thoughts for now. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know who is next. Councilperson Colasetti, perhaps?
I don't know that I was. I think that both Chris and Maurice haven't had a chance to weigh in genre, so I can wait my turn. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Who is next? I'm sorry. I just see Councilperson Quisenberry. Oh, Evans is also up.
Why don't you go with Chris next?
Yeah.
Thanks, James. Yeah, I just want to echo Alderperson Wu's point about how do we get this into the community. I very much support town halls. I would also suggest that we allow for verbal input, not just written input, and not just online input. So I don't know how we make verbal space. And certainly public input at every city council meeting counts, and certainly a town hall would be helpful. I'm like Alderperson Wilkins' point of views. I don't know how just 1 or 2 things are going to be. I don't know. I mean, I agree that I would like to see, maybe 3 or 4 things be an option for our priorities. But I guess we'll talk about that later. Thank you very much for the presentation and all this organization and all this work. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Therese is the next person who hasn't spoken yet.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see your hand up. Please feel free to go ahead.
That's okay. Yeah, it's good. Kind of difficult.
What's in the leaves there? Yeah, go ahead.
I guess the thing that I'm thinking about in terms of also another way of having communication within the community too, is that we can, when we're talking about reaching out to different institutions and organizations, I know a lot of times churches are helpful, or wherever, worshiping services, as far as putting in announcements and having the surveys there for people who want to participate in the particular survey available at different churches, because some churches and other worshiping areas are meeting in person as well as doing online or Facebook services. So I think it would be beneficial to have those available for the congregants of different areas. I think that would cover quite a few also, just to have it, because like Dr. Underwood said, there is issues, with older people filling stuff out. And if you've got the paper right there in front of you, you can write what you want and send it back to the city, do it that way. That may be have something that's already pre-posted, or somebody just puts a stamp on it and they can put it in the mailbox and have it mailed back to the city that way too, or to whatever address to you guys, to RPC or whatever. That may be also a helpful way to communicate. The other thing that I have to agree with James as far as the outdoor, more outdoor spaces, in the sense, because of the fact that because of the pandemic, it's not like we didn't have outdoor events and such before the pandemic. The city provided a lot of different events. We can only really safely provide that again after everyone is, I think when we feel that people are healthy enough, or it's a healthy enough environment for that to happen. So I think that that's probably one of the things that's on. It's kind of difficult I would think, to invest monies into that right now. That's all I have to say.
Thank you.
I think
And
Chandra
then-
Bishop didn't have a chance to speak yet.
Yeah, Chandra.
Hi, thank you. So I've got a couple quick questions. So there are 6 categories you presented, and you said the survey is going to ask for the top 1 or 2. So what's like the go number? You want to have 4 final categories, or 6, or what are you thinking as far as that, having people pick 1 or 2?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, that's a suggestion. We don't technically have any particular goal in mind. The goal is really just to start figuring out which ones kind of rise to the top in terms of public priority. So we can ask as many as you think are appropriate. We can end up with as many as you think are appropriate. We're really just here to facilitate a process. Part of what is helpful about narrowing down the priorities is also that when we get to the point of the developing a concept plan within each of these priority areas, we're going to want to define specific goals and objectives that we intend for this money to accomplish. And that will all serve as a way not only to document kind of the utility of the money, but it will also allow you all to help kind of assess applications, you know, be able to select, you know, which projects or agencies or, you know, events or other investments are really going to get us to the goals that we've set. So the intent of the concept plan is to articulate what we want this money to achieve. And so it's really just logistically, it's helpful if it's fewer, you know, if it's more narrow than broad, but there truly is no particular number in mind. And once we get to the public input, even if we say 4, maybe there's only 2 obvious, you know, common priorities that are really standing out. Part of it is just we'll have to wait and see what kind of input and feedback we're getting.
I mean, I like the idea of listing several and then asking for fewer that's listed. So as you said, the most salient and the most important rises to the top. Another question, what is your time frame of, you know, collecting the survey responses? Because I think that also lends itself to how to do the survey outreach, given what sort of time frame you're looking to do it in.
Yeah, that's a good question. So in order to move this process forward, you know, as quickly as possible, that said, it wouldn't be less than 2 weeks. And it could be 3 or 4 weeks, depending on the kind of outreach we want to do. Ideally, we would plan enough in advance to know over these next 2 weeks, we're going to, you know, get paper surveys to City Hall and the library, these 6 churches, these other 2 organizations, and you know, these 3 schools have agreed to send them home. You know, we'll come up with some sort of plan with the city and with other stakeholders to see kind of what's possible, and then try to execute it kind of as efficiently as possible. Like I said, ideally that would be 2 weeks, but I don't know if that's feasible yet.
And one last thing, when your colleague JD, I think it was going through his slides, there were slides with examples or initiatives that other cities were doing. I think that is helpful, so that people, when they're choosing their priorities, they can see examples of, you know, the initiatives that, you know, could be done under these. Because if you say things like human rights and social what does that look like? So how will people know they want investments in that area. So
Mhm.
just something to think about. And like you say, you may have definitions, but I think also examples would be helpful as well.
That makes sense. Yeah. Thank you. I think that will be the hardest part, is trying to get people on as much of the same page as possible when they're responding to these questions. Let's see. Quisenberry?
You're muted.
I feel kind of the same way as Grace does with talking about the difficulty of choosing a couple. And I'm going to suggest something that may be more complicated than we want to take on, but I prefer ranking in this kind of thing to give everybody a chance to put them all on there, but in the
Sure.
order that they prioritize them. And maybe we only use the top 2 or top 3 ranked from people, but they get to have their say about all the categories, and then maybe they leave some off because they don't prioritize them. But I know that it's easier to do with an online survey. It gets harder to do with a paper survey and an interview process.
Yeah, that's an option. We had talked through that as well. So I think that's feasible. That doesn't seem too crazy.
Jaya's hand is up.
Thank you. And I will admit my next question might be a little bit outside of the scope of this particular conversation. And if the mayor or staff want to jump in, please do. I think with this timeline and, still gathering information and the intentional nature of this process, which, I understand is important, I can't help but think about emergent needs that might come up. So for example, we have the eviction moratorium that has lapsed, right? So we have people right now who are facing homelessness. So I guess I'm wondering about the ability, we have half of this money already available to us to be more responsive to the current needs so that we're not just looking at that long-term recovery, which of course is one of the incredible benefits of this funding, but also thinking about the immediate and emergent needs that are still happening in the pandemic right now.
That's a great question. And city staff, feel free to chime in as well. I would just say, again, we're the facilitators and you all are the deciders. And so truly, if something comes up, it is within your power and your purview to consider projects kind of outside of this framework. So the goal of this is to kind of get some sort of cohesive document together that helps with reporting, but also project selection, et cetera. That said, other things will come up. Things might be more time sensitive. That is certainly within your ability to schedule those kinds of decisions outside of this process. And particularly with that additional flexibility in the final rule that allows for cities a lot more flexibility with that initial 10 million of government service money. So yeah, according to the rule and according to our kind of role in this, that is absolutely doable.
Thank you. And thank you again for all the work on this. I know it's an incredible amount of information to gather and put together in a very easily understood way. And I think that I would echo what was shared of having those examples to share with the community as we're asking for that feedback is very helpful as well.
Right.
I would also suggest when you give examples of possible uses that we use examples also from if Champaign County has identified their broader categories, as well as the city of Champaign and any neighboring communities in Champaign County, because that's where we can leverage and collaborate. And I would point out that we do, through the comp plan process, staff has managed to pull together really good lists of all the neighborhood groups and business community members. And there's a whole lot of new contact information that's been developed over the past year through the comprehensive plan process. So that's another way to reach the community pretty efficiently.
Great, thank you. Councilperson Wilkin, did you have another comment or question?
Yes, thank you. Oops. So I would echo as much information as possible for the public with the survey, and I'm looking forward to having these slides to further digest more. And as far as the survey specifically too, I was wondering how you were planning to go about with Urbana resident versus non-residents. With my thoughts being that, I welcome feedback, people that interact with Urbana, although they might not be residents. And I think that's an important piece of demographic information as well, if we're welcoming that.
Yes, that's a good point and a question that has come up. So part of our demographic questions, generally, we're trying to make sure whatever population we're reaching is reflective of, the general demographics of the area, and that we're not underrepresenting any groups. One of the questions we often ask is, what is your closest intersection to your home, to get a sense of where people live, what neighborhoods they live in. So that question could help kind of filter out anyone not actually living in Urbana if we want to be more exclusive to Urbana residents, which I think is entirely appropriate in this particular case. That's one avenue for that. Usually all of our demographic or personal information questions are optional, but they're, we can make any required if that's kind of a necessary element that that would be important to filter by.
I think it would be just an interesting, yes, no question. Are you an Urbana resident? And again, the way I see it, I welcome that kind of feedback, but I would be interested if there are any trends, however it goes, that might be an interesting thing to know.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if there's already been a discussion or decision, or where we stand with how much the city is planning to use. So what we're working with this remaining amount.
We'll be able to get that to you within a few weeks. Okay. Maybe even sooner. We have a general idea. We're still working on some individual parts.
Okay, thank you. Because I am, definitely interested in that and more conversations along the way whenever possible. Love as much information and input as we can. And I was wondering about that, the next steps. So thank you for answering that question. That we'll have some information on the city request for spending soon. And then my understanding with this RPC process is that we'll hear back from you after the public input has been collected. Is that correct, from the survey?
Yes, so that is the plan, is that I think on the next slide, perhaps, maybe one more. Oh yeah, no, that's the one, sorry. Yes, our plan to present next would ideally be April-ish, if we were able to get all of the public input kind of rolled out and processed in that amount of time. Of course, that depends if we extend the input period or not. But the idea being, these are the findings. What more do we need to know in order to move forward? At that point, hopefully we would then know kind of how much the city is planning to use on city-specific expenses. And then how do we go about narrowing the scope? And maybe narrowing the scope is not quite the right word, but how do we go about setting kind of tangible goals and objectives to kind of, drive or provide some sort of framework for this funding?
Great. And I look forward to that. I don't know if we have maybe time. There's never enough time, but if we have time for a special meeting or a whole discussion point or something, I think as much time as we can to have input would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, and I like the ideas of town halls as well. And if that's something, I was taking notes, of course, during the public input portion of this meeting. But if a town hall or a special input session or something is something that the council itself wants to facilitate, that's fine. Or we can talk about other ways to do that if that's not possible or desirable for some reason. But having an in-person option would certainly be a good thing as well. And I appreciate the comment too about having non-written options as well, whether that's a phone number or other ways for people to communicate their input.
Is that something they can work on together? I imagine that would be kind of a joint process because the town halls
Yes.
are a city thing.
Yeah.
Work together on that.
What is your preference, in person or Zoom for a town hall?
In person. After Omicron.
Or possibly both. I don't know. Like the last series, we had 2 at different times and different days. And if maybe one could be on Zoom, one could be in person, then it makes it a little more accessible both ways.
Right. That was pre-Omicron. Okay. One of each.
Yeah, I kind of prefer in person as well.
Okay. We'll see how we can make that work.
So just to kind of summarize some of the initial feedback, is everyone in favor then of kind of focusing at this time on the first 5 priorities and leaving out public spaces and resources? And even like someone else mentioned, obviously not that no public resources or spaces could be invested in, but maybe rolling some of that into public health and safety, for instance, or even economic recovery and development. I see some nods.
Yeah.
I think, I don't know, my initial thought would be just leave it for now and see how, it's ranked in the survey from there. And I think that also, I don't know, I think it can be an issue too, if we're trying to narrow it down so that we have less things and we can fund them more, maybe more monetarily wise and more energy, more efficiently. And so it's also like, if we're cutting one, but we're just kind of really adding it under another one, like, is it really cutting down things, or are they really different things that we can just evaluate themselves? So I'd be interested in leaving it on just to let it go through the survey process and see how it ranks for the public as far as priorities. Any other comments on that? I thought I saw Mr. Evans maybe say something, but.
Well, I was just going to say that as far as public spaces go, we have kind of the equity infrastructure plan with $2 million that we've already set aside for infrastructure projects that might involve public spaces. But so yeah, maybe Grace is right. Maybe leave it on there just to see what develops.
And I also think that the further defining and giving examples will help, because also now the more that I think about it, when it's like public spaces and resources, like what if someone was thinking they want more mental health support services, like that could go under social services or public space, public resources or public health. I think that it would be good to kind of narrow that or define those well, as we've talked about. And then I like the open-ended questions afterwards too. So that might help understand more what people's understandings of them are. Okay, so do we need to do a show of hands about this last category? Or should we just keep it on?
Straw poll, who's in favor of keeping all 6 of the categories? 1, 2, I see 3 hands. Who's in favor of 5 of the 6? 1, 2, 3, 4. Is that right? Am I counting right? Sounds like we're gonna go with 5.
Okay.
But as you say, there's a lot of ways to fit things into the 5 categories.
Okay, that sounds good. That's helpful for going forward. Okay, so at this point, we will put together a survey with the 5 categories, including definitions and examples in a way that is as concise and digestible as possible. And then we'll work with the city on the we're calling them town halls, I believe, one Zoom and one in person. We'll be happy to help facilitate that. Any other questions? And we will work, continue to work on how to get, how to do outreach in a way that reaches as many people as possible. And we welcome any comments or suggestions for locations or agencies to work with. Councilperson Wu?
My only question is, I had a couple of items that I think might be helpful to add to the surveys and background characteristics. So would it be, when are you planning to go live with the survey?
It would not be, at this point, it would not be before March 1, I would say. Well, no, that's not true. End of February at the earliest, to pull it together and get an outreach plan in place.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions about the survey itself? Okay, well, that will be our first step to getting input. We'll see what emerges, and we will report back with additional information. JD, if you could go to the next slide. Just to kind of clarify, we do take seriously accessibility and ADA web accessibility. So we do have experience with translators and different online tools and other tools to help make this as accessible as possible. Next slide. You can probably hear my dog, please ignore that. So we went over this a little bit. Then at the next meeting, we would look at those results and go over kind of where are we and what more do we need to know in order to start kind of coming up with overarching goals and objectives and narrowing the scope of the actual funding. And then last slide. With the next major phase being developing a concept plan. So with the intention that this would be kind of a comprehensive document that would let the public and the administration know what are the city's goals with this funding, how are we measuring its effectiveness, and what are the responsibilities of funding recipients and the ongoing reporting requirements. So that being kind of the next major phase after we can start to narrow down the goals of the council for this funding. I believe that's all we have. Are there anything else that you wanted to add, JD, or any other remaining questions for from the council?
Ashley, do you have an idea when the website would be live?
Good question. So I don't have a specific date. We also are experiencing staffing shortages at RPC, but it will be live before public input at the very latest. Yeah.
So when it is, we'll let people know.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Well, we've got another presentation following this, so I think we'll move on. And if you have other questions, who should questions be directed to? Through Will?
Sure, Will,
yeah,
or me directly, sure. Yes,
okay.
Thank you.
I think from council members, direct them to Will, and then he can funnel them to RPC.
Perfect.
Most efficient. Okay.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And the slides from tonight will be, I think we can mail them out to council, and they will be as part of the meeting record as well.
I have a burning question on that one. Do we have a second?
Burning question? Okay.
Yeah. I was just wondering how the socioeconomic background that was included in our packet fits into this. I was a little surprised that that wasn't the presentation we're having tonight, and I'm wondering where that fits in.
That is a good question. Thanks for asking. So I'm glad it was in the packet. I hope everyone had a chance to look at it. Essentially, it's in there because the funding itself, and this was a little bit more relevant before the final rule, but the funding itself has additional flexibility for populations that have been impacted more or disproportionately. On top of that, that is part of the best practices, is to really try to get these recovery funds into the hands of the people that need it most. And so we wanted to give the council kind of a baseline knowledge of where people in those categories live. So that could mean a lot of different things. It could have to do with age, income, race, ethnicity. We wanted to give you all just kind of a general understanding of where the neighborhoods with the highest needs or most overlapping needs are. That doesn't necessarily impact these funding priorities per se, but I feel like it will probably be more relevant as you are coming to evaluate different applications or different projects that are applying for funding. So it's relevant, just maybe not immediately, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you for the explanation, and thanks for letting me slide in a burning question.
Thanks. Okay, we'll move on to the financial forecast presentation, and we'll need to admit Elizabeth Hannon and Allie Robinson as panelists. Thanks again, Ashley and JB. And Elizabeth, is there anyone else that needs to be admitted?
No, just me and Allie. I can't see whether she's in here at this point, but
yes, she is. Yeah.
Okay.
Go
All
ahead.
right. So I am going to start by sharing my screen here. And I will start off the presentation and then turn it over to Allie soon. Okay, you should be seeing that now. So I know that this is the first time that this particular city council has been through this process, so I might take a little extra time with a couple of things. So our financial policies require that we prepare a financial forecast annually. And the reason for doing that is we want to look at our fiscal condition each year and then make strategic decisions about the city's budget for the coming year. So this is really what I think of as the first step in our annual budget process. This focuses exclusively on the general operating fund, which is where we pay for most basic city services, pays for virtually everything in the police and fire departments, and most public works services. So again, we're evaluating financial condition and looking at very high level decisions about the budget process. So one thing I have to tell you is I'm not hiding a crystal ball in my office. We can't actually predict the future with 100% accuracy, or even 95% probably. So there's a lot of risk involved in this kind of exercise. So, and that is true of every forecast. So we'll talk a lot about the likely scenario, which includes the assumptions that we think are most probable. And that is what we will plan around. However, in this process, there's a lot of work behind this that you're not necessarily going to see. We also developed what we consider to be an optimistic scenario, and we also developed kind of a worst case. So we have best case and worst case that kind of bracket that to give us a whole range of options. And again, while we'll plan for the likely scenario, we are always monitoring for improvement or deterioration throughout the year. So if something drastic were to start happening with any of our major revenues, we would probably be talking about that during the year. I'm also going to say that I've been doing this kind of stuff for a lot of years, both here and in another city. Sorry. And this period of time is the most challenging that I can recall for doing this kind of work. The situation that we're dealing with the pandemic is just unprecedented, and there's not a lot to go on. So obviously, pandemic is a big feature of this forecast. while we're already in recovery and we expect that to continue, that's going to remain a critical factor. And we don't know for how long. You know, emergence of different COVID variants and how we respond to it is going to continue to influence our outlook. And so again, we have a very high degree of uncertainty, and nobody can tell us when the pandemic is going to end. I wish I could tell you that, but I'm, you know, I think we've heard guesses in the past, and many of them have proved to be wrong. So I do want to take a step back because most of you were not here during the previous 4 years where we were basically working on getting our budget into alignment. So just by way of background, over the 4 years, beginning in fiscal 18 and through FY21, we worked very hard to eliminate a structural budget deficit of $2.5 million. And this chart shows the cumulative expenditure reductions and revenue increases that were recommended by the mayor and approved by the city council to do that. So in blue, you see the expenditure reductions accumulating to a total of 1.34 million, and then revenue increases accumulating to a total of 1.15 million over that period of time. And at that point, we fully expected that we were going to have a balanced and sustainable budget going forward. And almost as soon as we said that, within a couple of months, the pandemic started. So where we are right now is we're heading into fiscal 23 in better shape financially than we have been in a long time. So we do have some flexibility to be thoughtful about how we respond to this situation. I think we're able to wait for more clarity before we have to take any action. And we really want to focus on using that time to prepare for what might be in our future. So I am going to give this to Allie, and she's going to talk a little bit more about the details.
All right, so after some economic declines from the pandemic, we've seen a strong rebound in some of our major revenues in fiscal year 2022. And one of the most significant change is sales tax, which is the largest revenue source for the general operating fund. And so this chart compares state sales tax revenue for the first 6 months of fiscal year 2022 to the same months in prior fiscal years, both pre-pandemic and pandemic months. And then these receipts represent sales that occurred from April through September, since there is a 3-month lag from when the tax is collected and when the city receives the revenue. And as you can see, the blue lines represent the fiscal year 2022 revenues, which well exceeded pre-pandemic and pandemic figures. Next slide, please. So home rule sales tax also show the same trend as state sales tax during the first 6 months of fiscal year 2022. And as a result, we projected that this upward trend in sales tax will remain stable throughout the remainder of fiscal year 2022. However, we assume that this significant growth we're seeing will be temporary, and by fiscal year 2023, recovery growth will return to the pre-pandemic pace. And we projected fiscal year 2023 sales tax revenues to be about 8% lower than fiscal year 2022 projection, and then grow with Illinois real GDP growth rate throughout the forecast period. While this positive rebound we see in sales tax was driven by the increase in disposable income from the federal stimulus payment, this overall trend was also driven by a shift in consumer demand from services to goods. One of the determining factors of the economy's condition is its reliance on personal consumption expenditures to drive growth. So, this is typically used to measure the health of the economy under the assumption that households spend disposable income on goods and services when the economy is doing well, and reduce spending on goods and services when the economy is doing poorly. So this chart shows you year-over-year percentage change in goods and services. So during COVID-19 pandemic, it changed consumer shopping behavior. And as you can see, growth in PCE on goods grew while spending on services declined. Beginning of the pandemic, when government enforced stay-at-home, social distancing measures, and business restrictions, opportunities to spend on services have been limited, shifting spending towards goods and away from services. So consumers have opted to avoid or limit activities that involve in-person interactions. As we can see, the gap in growth between both goods and services has narrowed, indicating that this change in consumer spending behavior is temporary and that it is likely to return to a more pre-pandemic combination of spending on goods and services. So we use two primary indicators of fiscal health in this forecast. One is recurring expenditures as a % of recurring revenues. This indicates the ability to sustain expenditures for programs and services over the long term and ensures that the city does not make long-term commitments for which funding may not be available in the future. The city's current policy is budgeting recurring expenditures not more than 98.5% of recurring revenue. This provides a cushion against modest fluctuations. The second is fund balance as a % of recurring expenditures. This indicates the city's ability to withstand economic downturns, finance cash flow throughout the year, provide a stable tax rate, respond to natural disasters, and provide for unanticipated needs or unexpected opportunities. The city's current policy is maintaining a fund balance of at least 20% of recurring expenditures, but we will be preparing a resolution to increase the minimum fund balance policy from 20 to 25%, which will put the city in a better financial position to deal with any unexpected economic downturns or respond to a natural disaster. And this chart shows that under our likely scenario, recurring revenues exceed recurring expenditures in both fiscal year 2022 and 23. However, this reverses starting in fiscal year 24, where recurring expenditures slightly exceed our recurring revenues. We expect that over the long term, the trend reverses and we can maintain current services. And under the likely assumption, rate of growth in recurring expenditures outpaces the rate of growth in recurring revenues throughout most of the forecast period. And this is due to anticipated slower economic growth during recovery from the recession. And during this period, the release of new census data and incorporation of that data into the formula for distributing state shared revenues also contributes to the contraction of revenues in fiscal year 2023. The 2020 census showed a decrease in the city of Urbana's population count from 41,250 to 38,336. This is about 7% decrease, which will result in a lower distributions in income and use tax to the city in the future years, since the distributions are based on population. And this chart above shows the gap between recurring growth in recurring revenues and recurring expenses, closing by the end of fiscal year 27. Sustained development activity and recovery from the recession drive the closing gap. This next chart shows that fund balance will remain relatively stable throughout most of the forecast period. In the likely scenario, the city would expect to be above the current policy goal without significant adjustments to the budget for a couple of years, which provides some flexibility. Under the best case scenario, fund balance will increase over time. And in the worst case, fund balance will remain stable and start decreasing after fiscal year 2025. Focusing on the likely scenario, the fund balance is expected to exceed the recommended 25% fund balance throughout the forecast period. And it's quite likely that the 25% minimum balance level is adequate to deal with a worst case scenario or any unexpected events such as natural disaster. Now, based on guidelines provided by the Government Finance Officers Association, a minimum of 25% would be appropriate. And as I've mentioned earlier, we will be preparing a resolution to update the policy to increase the minimum fund balance policy from 20 to 25%. And any excess fund balance would most likely be allocated to one-time expenditures, such as additional funding for the equity and quality of life projects. And I'll turn it back over to Elizabeth.
Sorry about that. So we've recommended several strategies here, including prioritizing economic recovery for local businesses, continuing to prioritize economic development generally, because that is what supports long-term growth of our tax base, updating our fund balance policy to that 25% level that we've discussed, and we would like to bring that to council for approval next month. For the budget this year, we really recommend that we focus on maintaining current services. And so when I say that, I mean, we would not be looking at expanding services because we're not confident at this point that we could support that in the long term until we really see an end to the pandemic. And then we would also begin to plan for revenue increases. We always maintain a list of potential revenue sources. It's probably too early to make increases now without having specific programs or services in mind, but that could very well be necessary at some time in the next couple of years. So that's the forecast, and we're happy to answer questions.
Mary Alice.
I don't know if it's appropriate at this time because you're going to be bringing it, but I just thought I would pose the question. So my first question is, you showed a graph, maybe, I don't know, maybe page 15 or somewhere around there in terms of the likely fund balance. You talked about potentially changing the fund balance policy to 25%. So in this fiscal year, what is that percentage fund balance?
Honestly, I don't have that in front of me. I would have to look, but we're over 25% currently.
It should be significantly over 25% just based on that slide.
Right. It's always kind of a moving target, right? Because things are changing all the time and it's based on a projection. But you're right. We're projecting at the end of this year that we'll be significantly over 25%. But what we're also showing on that chart is that because in the near term, we're not showing a lot of growth in revenues, we will need, you saw the chart going down, we will need to spend that fund balance just to maintain current services. And we don't really know for how long because I can't tell you when the pandemic will end.
So I was also thinking on slide 11 and 12, you showed the likely reoccurring revenue expenses and the growth in recurring revenue expenses likely. So if I look at the slide 11 with the bar chart, it looks like that change happens in fiscal year 2024. And then I'm guessing that on slide 12 with the growth of reoccurring revenue, that just shows why that's occurring. Is that kind of the relationship between those two?
I think that's exactly right.
Okay. And I seem to remember that we addressed the percentage of fund balance a couple of years ago, and I don't recall what we set it at that time. Do you remember? I mean, I know that we're at 20%, but I don't remember what we raised it from.
Mm-hmm. So my recollection when I first got here is that we didn't have a policy on fund balance. And then I believe we adopted a policy of 15%, not necessarily because we thought that was the best policy, but it was what we were able to do at that time. And then we later increased it to 20%. And over the last year or more, we've been talking about increasing it to 25%.
Okay. And then for the new renovated Lincoln Hotel, we had kind of a incentive for bringing in that project. And I think if I remember correctly, it was supposed to be 5 years to pay off that incentive. Is that correct?
I'm not recalling exactly at this point how long it was going to be, but that the plan is that we're going to pay that off from related revenues, from property tax increment, from the special boutique hotel tax. So that's not reflected here because we're assuming we're not counting any new revenues, because we're assuming they're all going to the hotel project, and we're also not counting any new expense because that's kind of off to the side.
Right. I was just trying to figure out if some of that might offset the difference, because at best, I would be pretty against increasing taxes at the moment. I mean, we've gotten to the point where services, so on food, we raised that last time we were trying to close the gap in the budget. Between the home rule and the state sales tax, we're at 10%, a little bit above 10%. I think it's 10.5. So I'm hoping that we don't have to make another raise, because I think that's going to be really hard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so my recollection, and I don't have that in front of me, is that possibly we're going to pay that off over 10 years. But yet certainly at some point when the debt is paid off, then there's revenue available to the general fund.
So certainly with the forecast for the next 5 years, we can probably count on it not contributing to our revenue.
I think that's accurate, yes.
Okay, thank you.
James?
All right, Mary Alice asked the question I was going to ask first, which is how long has it been at 20%? And I guess it's been about 4 years, because Mary Alice remembers it changing to 20%. So I understand this to be is this a target or is this a requirement, the fund balance percentage?
So it's a policy that's approved by the city council. So what we say in the policy is, and again, I don't have this in front of me, but it basically says that that's our goal for budget purposes, right? And if we need to dip into that or go below that level, then it's my responsibility to come back to the city council and give you a plan to replenish that fund balance.
Yeah, it's we feel comfortable if we're at 25% that we have what we need to protect us against unanticipated issues, right? So if there's an issue like an ongoing pandemic, we can spend below that, but we have to know what our expectations are for how long that's going to go, and what we will do to get it back to 25% after we stop spending down.
Correct.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I understand that and make it clear that we're not going to hold to that 25% if we really need to spend that money based on an emergent economic situation. But we're either planning for how we're going to spend it down, or we're planning for how to get back to it, or we're even and we're happy. Is that a good summary? Okay, thank you.
And I will add, people have asked me, why do you need a fund balance like this? And my answer is to plan to be able to respond to unexpected situations. So when you think, well, we've come a long way since we started about 5 years ago. But if you think what's happened in the last 15 years in our local economy, we've had a major recession, we've had a tornado, and a global pandemic. And having a reserve funds allow us to respond to each of these things without impacting services.
And we had a state that refused to send money along at one point too.
Well, that's true. And then we had a state that cut our share of the income tax for a while and threatened some other things. So yeah, that's kind of a fourth uncertainty in our lives all the time. So.
Right. Yeah, that's the fact that we're in the state of Illinois is another risk factor for us that we have to consider.
It really is. I mean, it's not.
And I would also say, if not for that healthy fund balance earlier in the pandemic, we probably would have been scrambling to make budget cuts. But because of the healthy fund balance, we knew we could weather it and maintain some stability, and so we didn't feel the need to do that, and that so far that's proven to be a good decision.
And where other communities were laying people off, we did not. So that's another reason. Okay, sorry, looking at hands. Jaya, and then Grace.
To be fair, I just put my hand up. I think Sharice had theirs
sorry.
up for a while.
Oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
their people are put in order of when they put their hand up on the.
Really?
No.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yep.
Okay, Sharice.
You can trust it.
Okay.
Why am I just learning this now?
I know, me too. I'm just noticing it. One of the questions that I have is because Ali said something about, the fact that our census numbers were so low. So my question is, has there been any movement or any decision as to whether or not we are going to do a recount because that also affects our monies for services and so on and so forth. So is there anything coming through about that? Are we thinking about doing that census recount? Is there some kind of cost benefit analysis or something?
So I think certainly we're going to consider it, but we have to make sure it makes economic sense to do it, because there's a substantial cost to doing the special census. So we have to make sure that before the next census that we're really going to recover enough revenue that it actually makes sense.
Do you have an estimated estimate on what our annual loss of revenue is going to be?
In the general fund, it's smaller, but overall funds, I think it was around half a $1 million
a year.
Yeah, and that includes this affects motor fuel tax and a couple of revenues outside the general fund.
So I guess because I want to just get an understanding. So let's say that their numbers are wrong and we actually have more people than what the census says, meaning that we'd have more. Is there a possibility that we get more revenue or more whatever that could make up for what we would lose from other resources?
Correct. It's possible we could receive more revenue as a result of a special census. The question is it enough? But by the time we can actually do the special census and get the results and get our revenues adjusted, is it enough in that period before the next census for it to make sense to do the special census?
We can't do the earliest you can do a special census is in 2023. And then by the time you get the results and they're certified and that kicks in, we will have lost several years of income. So it could amount to a couple $1 million no matter what of lost revenue from.
And then on top of that, we have to pay for it.
You pay for every cent of it, yes. And you have to and provide the space and all the equipment and recruit the people to work. It's all the work is on the city.
Okay, thanks.
But yeah, we will lose at least guaranteed probably $2 million total, no matter what happens, which is one of the things we'll consider when we're looking at COVID-related revenue losses. This is due to the pandemic.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Grace.
Thank you for the presentation. And I was hoping to understand some of these graphs a little better. One of them is the growth, reoccurring revenue, and expense likely. And I'm still not understanding the steep increase in growth of revenue from 23 to 24. especially with the blurb talking about decreased population and saying increased development could contribute to closing the gap. I don't know if we're relying on that or thinking that'll be a quick pandemic upswing and then plateau. I was wondering if I just have another explanation about that.
So I'm going to ask Allie to jump in here too, but part of what you're seeing is that there's actually a decrease in FY23. So it's a big bounce from a decrease to a little bit of increase in FY24. So those are negative numbers on the revenue line in FY23. And that has to do, a lot of that has to do with sales tax and this trend we've seen where people are spending more on goods actually during the pandemic, which was kind of a surprise initially. It was a little hard to wrap our heads around that. But we actually think in FY23, we're going to see a decrease, right? Because we're going to go back to maybe what would be considered a more normal level. And so that's part of what's driving that decrease in FY23. Is Allie, do you want to do anything else?
Right. So the FY23 that decrease right there, it shows you FY 2022, we actually have more revenues than we have anticipated. So that decrease that you are seeing in FY23, it's because we are assuming that we're going to return to a more normal pre-pandemic pace.
Okay, because then on the graph before that in the packet, the likely reoccurring revenues and expenses. So I can see that like the green revenue on 22, I guess is slightly lower on 23, you're saying, and then it's consistent growth at around 4% after that. Is that right? Okay.
Yeah.
And then I was wondering also if you could explain the graph about likely fund balance, and it looks like there's the steady decrease in fund balance, but still above that 25%. I don't know if you could explain how that works.
Yeah, so what's happening during that period, and again, this is a big part of the uncertainty, is that we're actually for at least a couple of years spending fund balance to maintain services, because we have the luxury of doing that because we have that healthy fund balance. But without that, we might actually be having to make cuts. So, and that obviously, looking out a couple of years is much easier than looking out 3, 4, 5 years. That gets a lot less certain as you go further into the future. But we do expect that we're going to be spending down fund balance to maintain services.
I see. So taking the kind of the healthy year this year and then sucking off of that a little over the next years to cover the gaps.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Thanks for explaining that. And, I appreciate the work that's been done to have a sustainable budget and funds and healthy fund balance and things. I think that is important. And I also don't want to lose sight of serving the people of Urbana. Like I said, I understand that those things are important. And I also hope that some of this can also not just be absorbed into the city, but also looking at, we talked about maintaining services are great, but also ways there's a lot of other, goals that we're making and a lot of other things that we'd like to see expanded. So I think whenever possible, it's great to have some of that going out for additional or new programming as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't really foresee any need ever in the long term, very long term, to maintain a fund balance that's more than 25%. So when we get to a point where our path forward is clear, when the pandemic is over, and if we have a fund balance like that, then that's an opportunity to do things like, put more money towards the Equal Project or something else. That's a one-time expense.
So you're saying it would be, after 2027 when that would be a possibility?
No, I'm gonna say I hope it's in another couple of years, right? Like I hope we have some certainty. We won't have a lot of certainty about our path forward until the pandemic is over. And I hope that's sooner rather than later, but I can't predict that accurately.
Thank you.
Jay.
So I want to just to clarify a little bit. So I can totally appreciate and understand the importance of having a healthy fund balance or, you know, rainy day fund. I was at an agency that didn't have that luxury during the state budget impasse, and, you know, have seen directly what an impact that can have on our community when folks don't have those resources. But if you could just clarify a little bit of where does the 25% number come from? I know there was kind of a mention of like maybe one area that it's recommended, just to get a little bit more clarity of, you know, it sounds like we've gradually been increasing. Is this the ultimate goal? Where did this number come from?
Yeah, I mean, my opinion is 25% is the ultimate goal that we've kind of been working towards all these, I don't know, 8+ years that I've been here, I think. There is an analysis that the Government Finance Officers Association provides, and it's basically a risk assessment. We've talked a lot about risk, but it assess all the risks that we face, and through that analysis, you come up with you know, a recommended range of appropriate fund balance. And so we are going to bring that back next month. And so when we do that, we can talk about that in a little bit more detail about why that number and what all those risks are that we're trying to hedge against.
Thank you. I did have one other question. I know there was a brief mention of the fact that there could be the possibility of using some of the ARPA money, you know, related to the general fund. Am I correct in assuming that that is not incorporated into this analysis, or is that something that is reflected somewhere here?
No, that is not included in the forecast, but there are also expenditures for some new things that you might want to do related to that. So it's just an option that's out there at this point.
Thank you.
Chris.
Yeah, to kind of combine Grace and Jay's question, Elizabeth, are you telling us, I mean, you said no expanding services until the pandemic's over, meaning no reoccurring new reoccurring expenditures until the pandemic's over. Is that what you're telling us?
That's what I am recommending, because we don't want to commit to new expenditures that then we can't maintain. We could, you know, go out and hire people and have to lay them off, or, you know, start a service that we can't continue. But we do expect that some of the things that you will do using ARPA funds may have a longer life beyond the ARPA funds, and we know that we will have to address that, you know, probably, you know, 2-3 years out into the future. So that's something that we kind of have on our radar, is something that we need to plan for.
Would we be dipping from the 25% fund balance, or you don't know yet?
I will be dipping from fund balance, I think, in the next couple of years, but I don't think we'll go below the 25%.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Grace?
Thank you. I guess just last question about where we go from here. I appreciated you saying that this is kind of the beginning of the budgeting cycle process. I guess I'm just wondering what are next steps and what council needs to be thinking about or looking into or prepared for.
Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of internal process that goes into putting together the proposed budget, and we'll be getting into that pretty quickly here. You will probably see the proposed budget in May, and so there will be opportunities for discussion and, you know, input at that point, or we can change up the process if we want to, you know, do something a little bit different.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I'll just be a broken record, say I always appreciate as much information and input as early as possible, whenever possible.
Last questions, anybody? Okay, well, thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Allie, for all the work into this. And we'll move on to council input and communications. Does any council member have comments or communications? Okay. I'm not seeing, oh, Grace?
Thanks. Just want to reiterate again, appreciating the city doing what it needs to do to be in a healthy financial state and take care of its employees and all of the internal things going on, and also trying to keep in sight serving the people of Urbana being the ultimate purpose of our government existing. Also, just random reminders about applying for equals ideas for the equals grants and taking COVID precautions. And I think one of my questions last week, which I appreciated unanswered for, but I think my ultimate question was kind of what are the current guidelines for COVID precautions currently in Urbana, as far as like, do we still have a mask mandate in order for the city or state things? Just because I think it's important to clarify, and I haven't found a clear answer on what things are still in place. And I think that's all for now. Thank you.
Okay. I'm not seeing the gallery on the screen. Okay, there we go. Any other council comments? Just to respond to the question about what's in place, we are, in terms of the city of Urbana policies, yes, we do have the mask mandate in the city building, and we are following CDC guidance as far as how we deal with exposures, quarantines, and isolations in the workplace. The state of Illinois, whatever mask mandate that's in place at the state of Illinois, as far as I know, is still there. But there's no citywide, there's no other citywide emergency orders in place at this time. But again, the message is, if you're not vaccinated, get vaccinated. If you're not boosted, get boosted. Wear a mask indoors, and take all of the public health precautions that have been recommended. To get through this pandemic, we have to get more people vaccinated. Okay, we will move on to unfinished business. There is none. Reports of standing committees. Sharice. And this would be consent agenda first and then regular agenda.
Yes. Okay, so I'd like to bring forth for approval the consent agenda to the City Council of Urbana. A resolution number 2022-01-002R, a resolution approving an intergovernmental agreement for animal control services. B, or ordinance number 2022-01-002, an ordinance authorizing purchase of certain real estate. Mumford, 1501 East Mumford Drive. C, ordinance number 2022-01-004, an ordinance authorizing the sale of certain real estate, 704 North Broadway Avenue, Habitat for Humanity. D, ordinance number 2022-01-005, an ordinance authorizing the sale of certain real estate, 1201 West Beslan Street. E, ordinance number 2022-01-006, an ordinance authorizing the sale of certain real estate, 1407 Wiley Drive. And and then those last two, so it was Lakendra O'Bannon and First Followers. And then F, resolution number 2022-01-003R, resolution adopting mayor and city council strategic goals for 2022 to 2023. Can I have a motion for, can I have a motion for approval? Are there any questions? Did
No,
anybody?
actually, you
That's a-
moved, you
I
moved
moved.
I'll second.
approval.
Okay, thank you. I always
Chandra, second?
mess up.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Is there any discussion or anybody want
Uh,
to? We don't
on
have
the-
discussion.
No, on the consent agenda, there is no discussion.
Okay, Ms.
Will the
Clark,
clerk,
call the roll. Sorry.
Mr. Quisenberry,
Yes.
Ms. Wilkin,
Yes.
Ms. Bishop,
Yes.
Ms. Colacetti,
Yes.
Ms. Hersey,
Yes.
Mr. Evans,
Yes.
Ms. Wu.
Yes.
that motion passes.
Our regular agenda item, ordinance number 2022-01-003. An ordinance revising the annual budget ordinance, budget amendment number 5, omnibus, and that's from HR and Finance. Can I get a motion for approval?
You're
You
making the
move
motion.
approval, but I'll make the second.
Okay. I'm sorry, I can still get that confused. Any discussion?
Okay,
Okay,
will the clerk please call the roll?
all right, there you go.
Ms. Wu,
Yes.
Mr. Evans,
Yes.
Ms. Hersey,
Yes.
Ms. Colacetti,
Yes.
Mr. Quisenberry,
Yes.
Ms. Bishop,
Yes.
Ms. Wilkin.
Yes.
And I believe I vote on that too, Phyllis.
Oh, this one, yeah.
Yes,
Okay, Mayor. There you go, I got you.
thanks. That motion passes. Any reports of officers? I don't believe we have any. Oh, Carol, your hand is up?
No, I don't think so.
Okay,
It wasn't intended to be.
okay. There is no new business, so with no further business before the council, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much.